restart this? No? Okay, we need the files to be different, so stop and start. And looks like we have plenty of battery.
Oh. All right, for those of you who are joining online, assuming you haven't seen my first presentation, my name is John Immel. I'm going to continue with my case on the nature of philosophy, how it is the driving force of human action, and how ultimately it has impacted the evolution of Western thought in particular, and specifically how it ultimately went to shape National Socialist Germany and how it is ultimately shaping the current United States of America. TANC 2013, I began explaining the evolutions of Western thought. And I started with all the way back from Heraclitus. I highly recommend that you, if you've not seen my TANC 2013 presentation, it's 5 hours, it's a lot of material, but it's essential to understanding. And one of the biggest challenges I had, for most Christians tend to believe that Christianity kind of sprang up out of whole cloth. But it actually has a very specific place in context of the evolutions of Western thought. And the roots of those ideas can be seen as far back as Plato, and the Pythagoreans, and ultimately many of our doctrines, our moral doctrines, come from the Cynics and the Stoics. Now, I am going to pick up where I left off there, because this will lay a foundation. I basically brought us up to effectively 200, about 150 AD last year. I'm going to pick up effectively at about 150 AD. With just a touch, I'm going to touch back on Plato. Remember earlier I said that there is an ironclad relationship between Augustine. Christian doctrine goes from Augustine to Luther to Calvin. The dirty little secret of Western thought, and in particular Christian thought, is that the roots of Augustine are really Plato. It's actually not really a dirty secret. The fact of the matter is that anyone with any effort at all can find this relationship. It's not a secret. It's hidden in plain sight for everybody. But I want to talk to you specifically about the evolution of Platonist thought that ends up in Augustine's hands. Plato, of course, wrote the Republic and many other works. He writes right around about 400 BC, give or take 50 years. He, of course, as the classical world starts to decline, he falls into some elements of obscurity. In roughly 200 AD, a guy by the name of Plotinus picks up Plato's doctrine. Now, Plotinus picks up the Cynic and Stoic doctrines. Now, if you will remember from last year, I will reiterate this point, the Cynics and Stoics believed that the flesh, that the material world was corrupt. Now, they predate Christianity by some time. So they don't get this from Christianity. Christianity largely picks up this soul-body dichotomy from the ancient Western thinkers. That the presumption, the soul-body dichotomy is that the material world is fundamentally corrupt, and that there is an ineffable other realm that is somehow pure. The Cynics and Stoics ultimately believed that the nature, and they had different variations on the same concept, but they ultimately believed that the way man approached and achieved knowledge, achieved virtue, was by the discipline of the flesh. That because the flesh was weak, it required kind of like an athlete's training. Well, this concept, of course, you can see the flavor of that concept in Paul's writing, who, of course, picked up a lot of these concepts from the Cynics and the Stoics. Paul tended to pick and choose whatever he thought advanced his particular ideas. But Plotinus takes these concepts, the Cynics and the Stoics, and he takes it to the next logical progression. Not only is the material world inferior, it is in fact totally morally depraved. Plato believed that this earth was a shadow variation of a perfect world. It was not, this world was not true reality. It was merely the image, it was really the reflection, the shadow on the wall of a cave. The otherworldly realm was called the world of the forms. Plato believed that man's grasp of reality was limited. Plato believed that man's ethical standard was his subordination to the state. Plato believed in compulsory state education. Plato believed in communism, and Plato believed in totalitarian government. Let me back up and make my observation in, oops, let's see. This right here, right? This right here is pretty much summarized in what Plato believed. Collective conformity, he believed in compulsory education. This is collective conformity. He believed that man was inferior, right? He believed that certain men, what he called philosopher kings, should be in charge. They should dictate good. Enter the Cynics and Stoics. The Stoics begin to actually have an impact on Western thought. They believed in the denial of flesh was an existential ideal. The physical body limits man's ability to attain virtues. They practiced a rigorous physical training to attain those virtues. The Cynic and Stoic ideal became the Christian ideal. You see this reflected in Paul's comments, I beat my body. It is better that man cut off a hand such that he enters the kingdom of heaven. The physical body is corrupt and the material world is corrupt. Plotinus, by contrast, now you need to understand this contrast, Plato still has a secular philosophy. In other words, he still believes that man, select men, can get to this transcendent world, this world of forms. And the way man does that is by virtue of his reason. Now, it wasn't a clean blanket statement that all men had this ability. It was really reserved for a select few men who specifically practiced virtues that gave them access to the forms and higher levels of knowledge. But it was still a secular version. He introduced...
Can I interject a question?
Sure.
Because I guess that's the way we're doing it in the conference, and if any of the speakers don't, want to wait till afterward, that's fine. Let me know. But Aristotle believed the same thing, but he believed everybody had that ability.
I'm actually going to talk at length about Aristotle, so
okay.
let me handle Aristotle when I get to Aristotle.
Okay.
I'm trying to illustrate. Plato's full philosophical statement introduces a transcendent reality, but it is still a secular reality. It still has man, some form of man, some of man's ability has the ability to get there. Plotinus drops all vestiges of the human element. According to Plotinus' disciples, Plotinus had zero interest in the physical life. His entire obsession was attaining a transcendent reality. But his transcendent reality was a religious transcendence. Now I need to make one specific note. He accepted the premise of the mystery cults, the Gnostics. Gnosticism said the Gnostics were a mystery cults that arose right between towards the end of the 1st century up through the middle of the 2nd century. And they said that because man is physically corrupt, there was a certain initiating practice that gave them access to the knowledge. And they were uniquely qualified to get to this knowledge by virtue of their specific denial of fleshly existence. Well, their condemnation of the physical world ultimately shows up in the latter part of the first century as a direct assault on Christianity, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. This concept is carried forward to Plotinus, and Plotinus ultimately says that man no longer has any ability to access this higher dimension. The only means by which man gets to this dimension is through revelation. Plato's transcendent world is a secular world. Man has some ability to get to it. Plotinus, it is no longer secular. It is entirely a religious realm, and it is only accessed through revelation. Do you see the difference? Do you see the fundamental difference? Yes? No? Think I'm crazy? Okay. A secular transcendent world is graspable because man is the secularizing part. But a religious transcendent world is not graspable because man has no place in that world. Now here's how Plotinus describes this. And I want you to hear the echoes of this that become Christianity. Let me read. The one is, in truth, beyond all statement. Whatever you say would limit it, the all-transcending, transcending even the most august mind, which alone of all things has true being, has no name. But we can but try to indicate, if possible, something concerning it. If we do not grasp it by knowledge, what does that not mean that we do not seize it? How does man come to seize knowledge of a transcendent being? It is impossible for man to seize transcendent knowledge by reason. Now I want you to notice that he wanted reason to be part of man's incompetence. Man would be entirely dependent on mystic visions. Actually, my notes, I think, are actually in here. These are my notes. The all-transcendent was by mystic vision. To gain access to the transcendent was by mystic vision, or in Christian parlance, divine revelation. The next paragraph is something that Plotinus said. The all-transcendent God, the universe, the material world is left God out. Oh, for heaven's sake, John. These are terrible. These are actually still moments. The all-transcendent God, the universe, and the universe it left God to become. I really have written this wrong. The point being, the all-transcendent world and man, the corrupt world, are apart. They're not together anymore. It left God. The material world left God. That's his point. Now, once you understand Plotinus, it becomes very simple to understand Augustine. Because this is the version of Platonism that Augustine got hold of. He did not actually have the original versions. So Augustine sees, in his mind, he sees the one, the all-transcendent. He sees that as the Christian God. And it is from here, this is the fundamental framework within which he places Christianity. And here is why. Here's the problem with early Christianity. Jesus shows up in Israel talking to Israelites about Israelite issues. He repeatedly says that he's talking to the lost children of Israel. He repeatedly says that his focus and ministry is specifically to them, and that it is limited. Which is why, particularly in the book of Mark and in the book of Matthew, you see virtually no recognition of a world beyond Palestine. You see functionally no understanding of the broader Hellenistic world. Now, the first two Gospels, Matthew and I believe it's Mark being the first, Matthew I believe being the second, they have no broader exposure because it was not important to them. The original sources were compiled were to those specific audiences. By the time we get to Luke, of course, being a Roman, has much more concern with the broader Hellenistic world. And his original works are actually to someone named Theophilus. Now, doesn't matter if Theophilus was a man or a general word for a group of people. Ultimately, Luke's interest is to a broader Greek world. And so Luke's focus, but even then, Luke's focus is only in as much as he wants to show the progression of effectively the Great Commission, go into the uttermost parts of the earth, to these people. That's his primary driving force. So even by the time we get to the book of Acts, he still is just focused on that evolution. Interestingly enough, Luke makes no mention of Paul's writings. We have Paul, but we have no mention of his writings, which tells me the early Christians had no real exposure to Paul's writings. And herein lay part of the problem. As this Jewish movement started out in this little backwater, know-nothing territory of the Roman Empire, moves into the broader Hellenistic world, it is confronted with some profound intellectual problems. The Hellenistic world has no association with the Jewish background of the things that Jesus said and did. And this becomes so stark and so dramatic that by the time we get to the Gospel of John, the introduction of the Gospel of John is a full-on polemic against Gnostic doctrines. And that's because the Gospel of John is probably dated sometime late in the 1st century. I'll stand in front of minutes here. So you have, by the time we get to the Gospel of John, we have very obviously now begun to encounter ideas that we do not know how to overcome. And the shaping and forming of those early traditions was hodgepodge, sporadic. And it didn't have a lot to do with what Jesus originally set out to do. So Jesus, these words, these Gospels, these many testimonies to this life of Jesus and the Jesus followers and the Jesus movement, now is confronted with the broader Roman world. Now trust me, the Roman world would have been fully acquainted with the evolutions of these ideas. The classical Greek world would have dominated their thoughts. They would have had some association. Now you'll remember this very strange encounter where Paul decides to go to Mars Hill and debate the living philosophers. And of course, Paul, he doesn't have satisfaction. He's bothered by these guys. Well, they were looking for a more robust intellectual solution. Paul, of course, thinks they should have just accepted what he said. And herein is the central problem. There was no quick way to explain the nature of the Jesus movement to this broader Hellenistic world, because it was not a full philosophical statement. It is a collection of stories and aphorisms and parables. And so to that world and to that mind, it did not have a lot of direct relevance. So by the time we get into the 2nd century, Christianity is really reeling from its exposure. Now remember, Paul said he went to the Gentiles, but the fact of the matter is he got no traction amongst the Gentiles. He ended up in the diaspora, talking to Jews, displaced Jews, and debating the merits of their diaspora theology up against the life and existence of Jesus. That's where Paul gets most of his traction. But to the broader Roman world, it doesn't get a lot of traction until you have men start to integrate these ideas, starting roughly in the 2nd century, into the broader philosophical statement. Now, the first people to actually try to incorporate, well, the actual one of the first was Philo. Philo was a Jew, and he was definitely a Hellenized Jew. And his goal was to take Platonism and merge it into Judaism. And he was one of a number who were making these attempts. So you see Christianity struggling because it does not have the ability to, it doesn't have a cohesive statement. It doesn't have the ability to win in the broader arena of ideas. It has some ideas that have some endurance, but it doesn't really have any really philosophical staying power, which is why by the middle of the 2nd century, ultimately when the church moved towards orthodoxy, it identified over 80 heresies. I made this point last year. Imagine the robust intellectual environment that must have existed for the people who ultimately purged heresies to identify 80 of them that had Christianity attached to it. That means there was enough ideas in action and enough variance on those ideas that they collected a tradition, and that tradition was ultimately seen as somehow antithetical to what was defined as orthodoxy. So you have a lot of intellectual activity. Unfortunately, the people in charge of who defined that orthodoxy, who defined that intellectual statement, believed in violence. And so they were ultimately able to purge it. And so, of course, this is Augustine's, this is actually Christianity up till about the 3rd century. This is Christianity's fundamental problem. How does it sustain in this broader, virtually hostile world? How does it sustain and compete with all of these other ideologies? Well, this is the fundamental problem that landed in Augustine's lap. And it was Augustine who set out to finalize the integration of these ideas. And what he used was the turnkey solution of Platonism to do it. Because he saw, of course, as I pointed out, he saw the fundamentals of the Christian transcendent religious concept in Plotinus. And that's what gives him the whole breadth of the statement. Now, concurrent with this, the Roman Empire is crumbling. There is a lot of chaos, both political and social, happening in the world. And so people are looking for some means and some way to begin to explain these things. And so a corrupt material world and a corrupt man in a war-torn and war-ravaged and famine-ravaged existence, this seemed to make an enormous amount of sense. Now, concurrent with Augustine is the political side of this equation. Oh, I need to describe one thing. Dogmatism. Augustine ultimately believes and accepts the doctrine of dogmatism. Dogmatism is the expectation that select men are morally qualified, morally justified in dictating intellectual content. Do I need to repeat that?
Yes.
Dogmatism is the belief that select men are morally correct, morally justified to create intellectual content. In other words, the defining measure of epistemology is force. Those morally qualified to use force. You understand? Okay. So Augustine ultimately believes, of course, man can't get to God but by revelation. The all-transcendent, he can't get there. The way he does get, the only way he ever experiences God is by revelation. God appoints select men who are morally qualified to dictate what that revelation is. Alakazam, we have dogmatism, right? Okay. Concurrent with these theological developments is a guy by the name of Theodosius. Christianity started emerging from the fringes of Roman society. Now, mind you, for the first 200-300 years, Christianity was this really very obscure, actually it was considered a mystery cult for the longest time. And people didn't know what it was. They were mostly scandalized. They considered Christians atheists because Christianity believed in one God, monotheism, which was a radical concept for that time period. And it was also, and so the broader Roman world, whenever they encountered these atheists, they condemned the Christians because they didn't offer God, sacrificed all of the gods, and all the bad things that were happening was the Christians' fault. So that's the early part. By the time we get about 250, Christianity is starting to emerge as a player in the social political structure of the world. By 300, the church was full of all sorts of political ambition. Bishops became effectively synonymous with rulers. Constantine then capitalizes on Christian statist ambition as he presided over the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea is when we decided the doctrine of the Trinity that you all take as an absolute doesn't actually show up until about 325. And it took about 50 years for them to finalize their formulations. So what you believe about the Trinity, that God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are one and the same, is a product of this specific event. Now, the reason it is the product is because ultimately Constantine says, you know what, guys, I'm tired of hearing you bicker. I'm going to put an end to this. And the Trinitarian doctrine that you all believe is what he said was it. And he called all opposing positions to be demented and insane. And then they decided to persecute anyone who happened to believe otherwise. And by the way, by contrast, basically the Homoian concept had been the dominant thought for the better part of 200 years. So the Trinitarian concept that you have was not the most prevalent doctrine. It was actually the preceding doctrine. A little bit of trivia for you. So, Constantine galvanizes ecumenical support for his power in the failing Roman Empire. He uses his civil authority to condemn opponents to what we now call the doctrine of the Trinity. In trade, the winning bishops pledge their allegiance to Constantine. Now, Constantine dies in 337, but the Council of Nicaea lasted for almost another 25 years. And as each year passed, the church became increasingly more embroiled in civil governance. And I want to read this. Fast forward through many civil wars and political machinations, wars with the Persians and endless skirmishes with the Goths, the death of Valentinian, the death of his brother Valens at the Battle of Adrianople, and the appointment of Flavius Theodosius to emperor in 379. Theodosius' role in history, and more importantly, church history, has been, as Charles Freeman notes in his book AD 381, airbrushed out of existence. This is a profound failing, because in 381, Theodosius, emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, decreed that all of his subjects were to pledge commitment to the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as co-equal, on pain of death. For the first time in Greco-Roman history, religious orthodoxy became synonymous with political power. In 381, the power of the state was galvanized into Christianity forever. This forever changed the face of the world, and from this point forward, the leading Christian theological concern was who had the authority, the force, to compel doctrinal outcomes. No matter the specific theological hair being split, the underlying fight was who held the force to suppress the dissenting opinion. By the way, that's from an article I wrote on spiritualtyranny.com. So I didn't plagiarize somebody, that's actually me. Here's why this is important. Secularism gets a black eye because we tend to assume that secular means immoral. This is actually not true. It's a false equation. Secularism only means the division of religious orthodoxy from political orthodoxy. A secular state is effectively an agnostic state. It means the state doesn't care. The force of government does not care what the specific religious convictions of people are. The Hellenistic world, and in particular the classical Greek world, was effectively, even though they believed in hundreds of gods, was effectively a secular state. Man could believe what he chose. He was not compelled by doctrine to believe anything. The only other manifestation of a truly secular state in the history of the world is the United States of America. And it is important people begin to grasp this. The single greatest political achievement the world has ever seen was a secular state, meaning man was free to believe what he wanted. The state didn't care, and neither should the state care. We're going to talk about this at length. This is the first point I want to make. Theocracy, on the other hand, is the merging of political power with theological orthodoxy. A theocracy means that man is compelled to a given theological standard by force of government. And this is exactly what happened with Theodosius. Augustine's doctrine then is able to reign effectively for the next 1,000 years without contest. No one can muster an objection because it is considered treason to object to Augustinian doctrine. Augustinian doctrine therefore stood unopposed. Man's metaphysical corruption, the doctrine of original sin. I ask you, just do some homework tonight. Go out and Google the doctrine of original sin. And if you do some work, you're going to find that the doctrine of original sin was actually proposed by a guy by the name of Irenaeus, a bishop of the Lyons, in about 250. If you read his definition of original sin, you won't recognize it. Because the doctrine of original sin that you know doesn't actually show up until about 400. And that was done by Augustine. Augustine basically decides, because he has carried forward all of the basic premises, the soul-body dichotomy, the mind-body dichotomy from the ancient Greek doctrine. He believes that man is epistemologically corrupt. He abandons reason, and he gains a commitment to dogmatism. Dogmatism being, of course, the presumption that select men are morally correct to dictate intellectual content. Of course, he believes in the primacy of the state, which is, of course, in his mind, the primacy of the church. Now, the practical application of this is the three estates through the Middle Ages. The three estates was a class society. The classes were broken down into three parts. Some pray, some fight, some work, which basically meant that in the feudal society it was organized around priests, knights, and serfs. Now I want to talk to you briefly. Remember when we were talking about the Cynics and the Stoics and how they approached the physical body. You have man's physical body, nature, and material world is physically corrupt. What does this mean practically? Do I have this right? Yes, I do. This produces what is known as asceticism. Asceticism is a philosophical commitment of the individual to destroy every facet of his physical existence. Asceticism is the practical application of the soul-body dichotomy, the evil material world put into practice. Christian asceticism took Paul's determination to beat his body literally and seriously. The church taught that asceticism, point one, gave access to the supernatural through the mortification, literally the death of the flesh. Paul's talked about the doctrines of mortification and vivification. Most Christians tend to assume that when we talk about mortification, we're really talking about something they can pick and choose. No. Literally, mortification, the death of the flesh. It also taught that it appeased or thwarted demons. It was believed that spirits, say for instance, it was believed that the spirits entered the body through food. It drew attention from God, that self-destruction would earn God's pity. Self-destruction showed God that man was full of guilt. I want to give you some examples of ascetic practice. The first one at the top of the list is celibacy. This is a very common one. Virginity was considered an ethical value, an ethical ideal, and it was tied to belief that the natural world was evil. Women, and it's actually hit women very hard through the Dark Ages, women had no sexual identity because women were either virginal or whores. Women were seen as tempters of men. Celibacy was the means to prevent, and I will make this observation, celibacy was also a means by which the Catholic Church could keep their property from disappearing into inheritance. Priests that don't marry, don't have kids, don't have wives, the church gets the money, the church gets taxes, the church keeps it. Because when the priest dies, he doesn't give it away to his family. Another ascetic practice was the renunciation of material possessions. For example, a guy by the name of Alexander Akoimidos. My Greek is rusty, so I don't know. Actually, I don't know Greek, so. He married poverty, which I think is hilarious, considering our current preoccupations with defining marriage in America. So he would beg his food and did not keep his excess. One commentator on Alexander's life said that his form of monasticism was better because it didn't create the housekeeping problems of, say, the Franciscans. In other words, he didn't have clutter. I think that's hilarious. Of course, another ascetic practice was the renunciation of food. The ideal Christian fasted for 40 days, as of course practiced by Jesus. It also turns out that starvation past 40 days kills you. They reduced or prevented sleep. They turned sleep into torture. They slept on beds of nails. They were beaten if they fell asleep. Syrian monks tied ropes around their abdomens and slept standing up. Others hung themselves in awkward positions. They condemned hygiene. They refused to cut their hair, fingernails, or toenails. They dressed in filthy rags and allowed sweat and dirt to accumulate. And do I really need to go in how much of that, how nasty that would have been? They abandoned movement. It was common to lock themselves away in monasteries. But they also then would take it farther and lock themselves into cells, into smaller and smaller cells. Some ascetics, and I find this horrific, would go into the desert, sit down on a pile of rocks, and stay there until their legs were out of the way. They beat their bodies. Men would stare into the sun until they were blind, so that they would never succumb to the lust of the eyes. Monastic orders wore iron girdles around their loins. They would do this so that they would not desire women. Castration and self-flagellation were very common. Now here's the point that I want to make. These practices never actually made it into general practice for the simple reason it is not livable. It is by definition designed to kill, this stuff. It is a commitment to death and destruction that cannot be practiced. But here's what I want you to notice. It was venerated. It was seen as an ethical ideal. The men who did practice such action were considered saints. The church turned these people into heroes. Because of Augustine, through the Dark Ages, we have an entire intellectual collapse. Reason cannot grasp God, and there is no earthly reality. Remember, we're talking about the all-transcendent, a mystical other world, an undefinable world, a world entirely apart from man at all. The only means by which he gets to reality is through revelation. Have you ever met somebody who is so heavenly minded they are of no earthly good? You've talked to them, right? And it's surreal. Everything they do is somehow proof text. The Puritans you talked about earlier, the way they justified, you know, what'd you say, the earthquakes? They said, how did they define that? I'm sorry, I don't think I remember.
It was like from the book of Amos, where God
right.
Thundered from Zion.
Right, God thunders from Zion. Well, they have an earthquake, and so the way they explain the earthquake is because God thunders from Zion. You talk to people like this, and everything they do they have no ability to grasp causality, just basic concepts like gravity. Everything they do is in terms of this grand, otherworldly perspective. Imagine an entire culture built like this. The entire culture is organized around this fundamental presumption. And I want to make the specific point of the proof text mindset, the need to use authority to validate ideas. The proof text mind cannot think in terms of causality. It is a mind that equates causality with authority. It is a mind that does not grasp principles. Proof texting is merely an appeal to authority, and it is the validation of rational content because of authority. Of course, what this really means is we're talking about an entire culture built on rational dependence. In other words, it gets all of its rational content from somebody who dictates. Of course, this is impossible for a scientific society because scientific society is built around rational independence, the ability to independently review the world and explore the world and find commonalities and find causalities. So the result through the Dark Ages was intellectual stagnation. It paralyzed all critical thinking. Authority was what governed human interaction, and the result was war, 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 and more war. Because God was always in the business of smiting someone else who got it wrong through the sword of the state. The concept of rights was really a discussion of prerogatives. The divine right of kings is really the divine prerogative of kings. The king is entitled to act without restriction, all based on, I do think I have this note, right? Yes, I do. Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. I would like to give you some fast facts about the Dark Ages. Infant mortality rates were estimated at 50%. Some sources suggest maybe as low as 30%. By age 12, a boy was considered old enough to pledge his life to his sovereign, meaning he was considered old enough to go to war. By 12, girls were considered old enough to marry. They were sold as chattel, considered a societal burden because they were a mouth to feed that could not endure the rigors of agricultural life. The concept of a dowry was designed to make marriageable females more attractive to male suitors. Men were basically paid to take on women. 95% of the population worked at agriculture with farm implements out of the Stone Age. Yields were estimated at a quarter of the seed sown, therefore it took roughly 2 acres to feed one person. By comparison, modern farming methods yields in excess of 80%, and it takes less than a third of an acre to feed one person. There was no concept of germs, no antibiotics, vaccines, no anesthetic. Anesthetic was considered sinful. Your pain was necessarily the product of your sin, and God deliberately did it to you. And this all made sense because, of course, suffering is a virtue. Death is a virtue. Pain was merely the natural state of human existence. The 3 estates divided in between some work, some pray, some fight. This practically meant that 95% of the populace were slaves. 2% did nothing, and the nobility fought wars of conquest for profit. The largest class, of course, were the people called the villani. This is it means villager, but it is our modern word is the root of our modern word, which is villain. They were born into slavery, a generational slavery, and this is important to understand. As a class society, as a class based on determinism, if you were born a serf, you would be a serf. Your grandson would be a serf. Your great-grandson would be a serf. Your great-grandfather would be a serf. There was effectively no escape. You were committed. You were basically born into subservience, and there was no ability to get out of it. This is, of course, the logical conclusion of Augustine's theories of predestination carried out to practical application.
John,
Yep.
let me quickly interject that the Puritans taught that upward mobility was a violation of the 5th commandment.
Yes.
Okay? If you wanted to be upward mobile, you were just disrespecting your parents' heritage and place in life.
Yes, it is exactly the same mindset.
Right.
Exactly the same body of doctrine.
In colonial America, in Boston, you could be put in stocks for dressing like somebody of the upper class.
Correct. It is exactly the same. It is exactly the same. Remember I told you that most people encounter their broader philosophical statement at the point of ethics. This is exactly the same thing. This is the ethical premise of moral inferiority put into practice. A villager, serf, his husband, wife, and surviving children, and I do mean surviving with mortality rates in upwards of 50%. I'm surviving. Lived in roughly 700 square feet, and they shared that space with livestock. 700 square feet would be... Oh, no, not even. Not even.
No.
Maybe from here to the wall. Small. Justice, and I use the bunny quotes, was meted out with brutal efficiency. Men who stole from the Lord's property, which was effectively everything in sight, could be penalized by being pilloried, drawn and quartered, cut open, limbs, noses, or ears cut off. Women who were accused of crimes, say, daring to seduce the priest or lord. And when I mean by seduce, I mean they lusted after her. Had their genitals impaled with hot irons, locked in iron maidens, burned at the stake, and drowned. The church sanctioned all of these actions by government, by Paul's quote in Romans 13. Can I borrow somebody's ESV? That was a joke. Somebody, certainly there's no ESVs in there, right?
Except for Paul. Except for Paul. He uses it for...
Romans 13, verse 1 and 2. Can somebody read it real loud for me? Go ahead, Andy.
This is King James.
It doesn't matter. It says the same thing.
Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. For whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation.
Correct. This is ultimately the foundation of the divine right of kings, the presumption that the king is appointed of God and whatever he happens to do is exactly what God chooses. This is also a corollary of the doctrine of predestination. It's what God intends. What you see manifest is specifically what God is after. The Dark Ages are dark in principle, and it's imperative that you understand what this means. Philosophically, it is dark on purpose. It is specifically trying to separate all of man from any good. The fundamental formulations of Augustinian doctrine sought to eradicate man on every fundamental level. Christianity elevated pain and suffering and pestilence and poverty to the highest ethical ideal. The whole of historic Christian doctrine revolves around the veneration of death. Human suffering reaches its pinnacle in Western thought. Destruction of the flesh is the ethical ideal. It's what you're striving to do. It doesn't take an art scholar to understand why the ichthus, the symbol of a fish, in remembrance of the disciples, was replaced by the cross as an enduring icon of Christianity. For the first 400 to 500 years, the cross does not appear in Christian art. But by the start of the 6th century, the cross, which is an emblem of political subjugation and torture, becomes Christianity's central icon. But what other icon would be appropriate for a religion built on human suffering? 400 years after Jesus came to preach life in the covenants of promise, Christianity became a cult of death that ruled the world with a nihilistic iron fist. I get some heat on occasion for calling Christianity a cult of death. But I challenge you. Show me I'm wrong. The sum of Christian doctrine is based on the death of man. It is obsessed and fixated on man's death. And it worships at an icon of death and torture. It holds out Jesus' death and destruction as its highest ethical action. It preaches at its root man's highest ethical ideal is his own self-destruction. Now I challenged you with this question. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. See, here's what I think is wrong with this question. The question must be, what causes good men to do nothing? If they are good, that presupposes they have values, right? That's what that presupposes. That the nature of values are such that they act consistent with those values, right? What causes good men to take no action? Change the definition of good. turn death and destruction into good. You want to know what happened to National Socialist Germany? Change the definition of good. Now, for me to actually explain why this is so important, we're going to have to do some more remedial work tomorrow. Because most people sitting in here don't really hold the Augustinian standard of good in their head. Most modern Calvinists don't hold the Augustinian, Lutheran, Calvin doctrine of good in their head. Most of them get their definition of good from a very different source. And that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Thank you.
Leave us on air. I've got some closing comments.
Can I make a statement?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was pondering your question to us, and I arrived at the same conclusion. I said, well, if you take the philosophy to its logical conclusion, doing nothing is man's greatest good. The realization of man's moral imperative is to do nothing. And what is the best way for man to do nothing is for man to no longer be.
Correct.
The closer man gets to doing nothing, the closer man gets to being dead, which
Correct.
is what all of this is about. It's all about telling man that his greatest moral good is to not be
Correct.
himself, which is death. And that's why good people do nothing, because the functional definition of good has been changed, just like you said.
And I want to continue to echo what Zach just said. This becomes crucial in understanding all tyrannies and all functions of tyrannies. Life is movement and action. Life requires the ability to identify and move and act towards values. The moment you eradicate values, you eradicate the premium of life, there is only one other option, and that is death. Another comment, Paul? I saw Andy, I think, says that's good.
Okay, well, okay, yeah, I've got lots of comments. A question came in from somebody observing the conference in regard to Andy's talk. Apparently she had a power outage or something, and by the time she got back, Andy was done. So we'll address that. I want to address that, make some closing comments. And as far as a question, the fish and the cross.
Yeah.
Okay. Throughout my young life as a Christian, you would hear Christians from time to time saying, yeah, you know, the cross, that's kind of weird. That's kind of like an electric chair hanging on top of a church, you know. That if Jesus would have come and died in our time, we wouldn't be worshiping a cross. We would be worshiping an electric chair, right? Yeah. Okay, so another thing is that people are very uncomfortable with. Overall, Jesus emphasized his death very little.
Actually, I would like to really expand that. The fact of the matter is that Jesus talked about his death very little and only within the last about 3 months of his life.
True.
He doesn't, it's never a big deal. And he actually avoids the conversation. And the only time he really pops off about it is after basically Peter, remember, get behind me, say
Yeah. Right.
has hounded him to the point that he doesn't have a choice but to say something about it. I have contended, well, for the better part, certainly since I left Sovereign Grace Ministries, the thing that clinched it for me, that I knew there was something fundamentally wrong with their doctrine, is they specifically define the gospel as Jesus crucified. when in actual fact Jesus never preached that. He let that be. The gospel, the thing that Jesus preached, is centered in in Luke 4, basically verses 17, 18, 19, and 20. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the captive. And he goes on to expand that the nature of the anointing on him was to improve people's lives. You never hear this message coming out of a pulpit. The definition of the gospel has always been abundant life. The definition, that the thing that Jesus brought to the table, the thing that made people gravitate to him with such power, is the fact that everywhere he went, people got better. Their life improved. And when confronted with the hardship that the disciples experienced, Jesus said, "Are you going to leave me?" And Peter goes, "Where are we going to go for words of a limitless life?" Now, the historic translation is eternal life, and that gets reinterpreted to be the all-transcendent, the future, the out there, the heavenly life. But the word is actually more better understood by limitless life. The cross was not central to what Jesus preached. And I contend ultimately it is an entire misunderstanding of what Paul was talking about when he talks about Christ. I preach Christ and him crucified. Christ is in fact the same word Messiah, which is the same word anointed, which is exactly a reflection of what is in Luke.
Again, though I see Bo's got his hand up, so I'll say this quickly and then turn over to Bo. Look, the Bible's got to be interpreted in context.
Yes.
When Paul said those things, he was. Let me just cut to the chase real quick. I'm not like those philosophers that come to you speaking all of this deep gnosis. Okay? I just came as a simple man who doesn't speak well originally speaking to you about the gospel of, actual biblical term here, the gospel of first importance. Okay? Yeah, when he came to Corinth originally preaching the gospel of first importance, okay, to people who were all turned upside down with all of this Greek philosophy, and you mentioned Philo. And in my estimation, in my studies, Philo was it in Jewish culture.
Yes, he was
He
very
dominated to the point to where Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You must be born again." Nicodemus has no clue as to what he's even talking about. Okay? And I guess my quick question is, before Bo comments, is how far does this go back, and to what degree can we compare this with Moses saying, "Choose life"? Okay?
Well, I've really never laid this out with any specificity, and it really does require being laid out with a lot of specificity. But I contend that life is the fundamental premise. It's the fundamental conflict. The issue has always been life or death. From the beginning with Adam, it was life or death. The issue was not sin directly. The issue was Adam's destruction. It was Adam's death. It was Adam's pain and suffering that were at issue. And so I think this actually is all reflective. It's all about man's life.
Yeah.
But
first of all, I'd say your talks have been very informative and thought-provoking. But think about the cross. I think I have to disagree with you on that. And
We allow that here.
1 Corinthians 1.
but wait a minute. Now you need to submit to my authority here.
Yeah.
And I need to say some words about all of this, so make sure we stay online.
Go ahead, Bill.
1 Corinthians 1:17-18, Apostle Paul said, "For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with words of wisdom, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God." I think the cross is maybe one of the central message of the Bible. All the
That's
it says he was the
fundamental.
lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Millions of animals were slain to point forward to the cross.
That is a very Christian anachronistic interpretation, and I understand where you get it, and I haven't really.
It's based on the Hebrew roots too. So there was a lamb slain that was just pointing forward to the death of Christ on the cross. And the reason it's important is because if we didn't have that, we would have a God that was not just. We'd have a God that was arbitrary and he did not punish sin. He let it go. He just closed his eyes and let it go. We would have an unholy God, going back to what Andy was preaching.
What I find fascinating, I'm going to answer your question, your observation this way. What I find fascinating is that for all of Protestant Christianity's determination to insist that it is not Catholic, it remains metaphysically Catholic, and it remains doctrinally Catholic. The explanation you just gave for Paul's assertion is very definitely has its roots way back in Augustine. And it's still
It's in the Bible.
no. And this is actually a very important point. There's a difference between something being in the Bible and the interpretive methodology that you arrive at a conclusion being necessarily biblical. And that is a hard. And it's one of the reasons I actually stay away from doctrinal arguments, because I think you have read in specific assumptions and you've cut and pasted ideas together that may or may not go together. And those are interpretive conclusions. And that is very different than there being a sound doctrine. Anyway, like I said, that's my take on the subject.
John the Baptist said, "Behold, the Lamb of God takes away the sins of the world."
Correct. But what John the Baptist said is not specifically related to what Paul said.
I have another question.
Sure.
I have a book at home. I think it's called "The Church in the Wilderness" by Wilkinson.
Okay.
And
David Wilkerson or Wilkerson?
No,
Okay.
I think I can find it, but he gives historic evidence that there was another branch of the original church, I think out of Antioch, that went to the east and actually proselytized over in India and China.
Correct.
They weren't affected by the Reformation and any of this stuff, but they existed until they were wiped out by the Jesuits, I think around 1500, and they kept the Sabbath. But one of the things I wanted to Sabbath, when did the Sunday Sabbath come in?
It was, if I remember correctly, it was then an expropriation of a Roman holiday. The Sunday, the sun mean actually, yeah.
It finds its roots.
Yeah, it defines its roots in, I think she's right. It's
The Sabbath?
Yeah. The Sunday Sabbath.
Sunday.
So are you familiar with that branch?
Actually, I am. I'm familiar enough with it. I understand. First of all, Christianity, the evolution of Christian thought is what I'm discussing is the Western thought. Christianity actually had many, I made this point earlier, Christianity had many flavors. You have the Eastern Orthodox Church, and you're exactly right. There was an entire evangelistic effort that made its way all the way to Japan. And it remained kind of an underground sect until it was destroyed and wiped out by, I don't remember, some emperor in Japan. And that, when we're talking, it lasted all the way to the 16th, 17th century. So they had, in a lot of the doctrines you see throughout the Eastern Orthodox Church, you wouldn't recognize specifically as Christian. I think their canon, I think one of the primary things is their canon is like 10 books, 8 books, something like that. They don't have all the books we have, or as Protestants. And of course the Catholic Church has 100 and whatever the heck it is, 90 something. So yes, I am familiar with those traditions. Andy, did you have a comment? You started to raise your hand.
I did, but now I can't remember what it is.
Okay, very good.
Just briefly, when we're talking about the pain and suffering, that was a concept that was very big with the Puritans too, where they really accused the Native American midwives of witchcraft, because the Native Americans had an herbal medicinal history, and the Native American midwives would actually give the women in labor
Mhm.
herbal brews that would lessen the pain.
Correct.
And if a Puritan midwife gave anything to lessen the pain of childbirth, they were accused of witchcraft and could be sent to their death, or they could be whipped in public, or they could at least be admonished in public. What we don't realize is the super amount of superstition brought over from Europe in regards and incorporated into religious thought.
Yes, correct.
But the reason that, the theological reason why they were not supposed to have anything to relieve pain was because she had the seed of Eve.
Correct.
And in her, and all women have the seed of Eve. Therefore, they are the lesser value, of lesser importance. They're the weaker vessel. All of that. Yeah.
Okay, I need to make a few closing statements. Leave us on air. Thanks, John.
Absolutely.
We've got an online question we want to address. Let me say a quick few things before we close. Look at that, even an early dinner. Okay? Now, why did I start TANC? Okay? The reason I started TANC is because conversation in Christianity and the debate in Christianity is not an honest intellectual debate. Okay? My goal in starting TANC was honest intellectual debate so that Christians can really make up their minds about what they believe with truthful information. Let me make an extreme statement to make a point. I don't care what you believe, but I do care that you've got factual information in which to choose your own way. Okay? That's what TANC's about. Truthfully, I do care what you believe. I've got my personal convictions. Okay? The major players of this organization, those associated, and myself, do not agree on everything. Okay? Frankly, I'm not afraid of ideas. And people within this organization are free to do so. Now, if you read my first book, Another Gospel, I have an introduction in there as to why I wrote that book. I only wanted to know what was going on. Okay? I only wanted to know what was going on in our church. They wouldn't tell me because I wasn't ready for their gnosis. Okay? And it costed me my family. Yes, Job gave me back my family. That's true. Okay? This runs deep in my soul. They should have just told me and let me make a choice. The New Calvinist movement is a movement that is leading millions of people astray based on disingenuous information. Okay? Total depravity doesn't just mean total depravity of unbelievers. It means total depravity of the saints. Solo Christos does not mean Christ, well, it doesn't mean Christ alone for justification, okay? It literally means Christ alone. The Father and the Holy Spirit are manifestations of Christ. Christ is the one true God. And I could go on and on and on and on and on. I was put in a position where I couldn't make a choice because people just wouldn't be honest about what they believed. Okay? If you believe that sanctification is 100% monergistic, just tell me, and I'll take my family and move on. No. Okay? So you know what? My goal is honest debate and giving people the ability to make choices based on facts. Does that make sense? Okay. In the process, there's going to be disagreements. Okay. There's going to be disagreements, and basically, that's again what this is about. What TANC is about. Okay, it's not about my specific view of the Bible. It's about intellectual honesty. Okay, in regard to these things, and a lot could be discussed. You know, we talked about this morning Luther's definition of what Paul meant. Again, basically, we have to search these things and the scriptures for ourselves. Okay. Again, let me reiterate, thank you, in context of what John's said tonight. Though I don't agree with all of it, it cannot be denied that the Lutheran construct is a seeking after death and not life. It's a running to knowledge of evil and not doing what the Bible says. Running away from evil to life and righteousness. Okay? Christians don't know enough about philosophy because these things are taught in the church, and because we don't know philosophy, have never been taught philosophy, and I'm guilty of it. Okay? My attitude towards learning philosophy as a new Christian was, he needs to know this. You know, Paul said it was all vain philosophy. Da, 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 da. That enabled me to be totally duped. Okay? And you know what? God, yeah, I stood for the truth, and I walked away, and I lost almost everything in a manner, as a matter of speaking. Okay? But God blessed immensely and traded. I got a much better life in the deal. Okay? But you know what? That still doesn't make it okay. I'm still not okay with it. And you know what? I don't think it's okay with Job, even though God gave him back all of his riches and a whole new family. I still don't think it's okay with Job that the Scythians wiped out his family. Excuse me. All right? So, I have called everybody to speak at this conference and give their input because I think they all have something very valuable to contribute to the goal of Christians thinking for themselves and making choices, life choices, based on truth and not orthodoxy. That's the goal of this ministry. All right? That's the goal of this ministry. Let's get rid of the stinking new Calvinists and then figure out everything else later. Okay? But people need to know what the definitions of. It's not okay that these yahoos have gotten away with redefining grammatical reality. It's not okay with me. And it's wreaked havoc on many people's lives. And talking about what's going on in the church in our day, listen, folks, starting in 2009, there was this humongous explosion of discernment blogs on steroids. This stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a reason for this. Okay? And I've quit going to discernment blogs. My goodness, the pain and the suffering that just is, you know, it's sad. But there's solutions. And the solutions are, don't, you know, somebody stand up and stop letting these people redefine the terms of the argument. Okay? That's our goal. Huge problem in people grappling to deal with this problem, in that most discernment blogs, and I close with this point, almost, most discernment blogs are run by Calvinists. You know, Wartburg Watch. Two Calvinist babes, okay, fighting tyranny, all right? Jeff Crippen, you know, I mean, you know, it's crazy, and obviously it's not going to suck. How deep does all of this stuff run? What Susan taught today, what John taught, how deep does this run? Let me tell you how deep it runs. Here's another important purpose of this ministry. Missionaries. Missionaries. Some of them go overseas and lose their lives. Why do they lose their lives in a lot of cases? So, man, such and such, he ministers in China, this country. Man, it's really dangerous. Okay? Christians are outlawed, in that country. And as good Christians, we stand up and say, yeah, Jesus is outlawed in that country. Christianity is outlawed, and man, let me explain something to you. In a lot of countries where Christianity is outlawed, it's valid because the Chinese and countries like them know more about Christianity than we do. For the most part, over the years, Christianity has been a Reconstructionist religion. If you're China and a missionary comes over from America, you do consider them a threat to the sovereignty of the nation because What was Calvin and Luther's attitude about dominion theology and all the kingdom on earth stuff? The Crusades. What I'm trying to say is Doug Wilson said that every inch of the world is owned by God, and therefore Christians ought to seek to own every inch of the world, its art, its education, everything. So when countries fear Christian missionaries, it's valid, okay? It's a dominion mentality. So a lot of times what I'm saying is that when Christians go over to countries, if their life is threatened, they ought to at least know really why. I put out my easy button. I meant to bring my easy button, okay? My red easy button where I push it, it's the Staples thing, okay? Knowing why you're in danger as a missionary in a foreign country, A, study all of the reasons in the history that they may think this. That's hard. We're outlawed in that country because they're against Christianity. That was easy. Because of Jesus. That was easy. They despised the cross. That was easy. No, it's not that easy. When my son-in-law went over to Africa, they brought with them just over-the-counter medicines. Okay? So when they went to this country over in Africa, it was in a place where those people can't get everyday pain medicine and stuff like that. Okay? My son-in-law is like the great white doctor. You know, there was this line, I guess really, really long line of children and people who waited in line for him to, like, give them Tylenol, to put a Band-Aid, an anesthetic on a cut. Now, where they were at, that's witchcraft. That's considered witchcraft. Okay? He actually put our family in danger by doing that. Where does that come from? Well, they're just a bunch of heathens, superstitious heathens over there. That was easy. No, it goes deeper than that. It goes to what John's talking about. Relieving pain is evil because as one pastor, actually the former church I went to, okay, so you have, Andy, tell me, what scripture is it where Paul talks about the treasures, we have this treasure in jars of clay? Okay, we've all heard that. So basically, over here in Africa, you've got that. Then over here in America, in high-class Springboro, in an upscale church, you have Russ Kennedy preaching that having this treasure or the glory of God in these earthen vessels means as that we seek suffering in our lives, in life beats upon our clay vessels and cracks and breaks them. God's glory shines out of the cracks and the breaks that life puts in our clay vessels. Andy doesn't like that. Okay. All right. It's the same thing. Okay? It's the same thing. Lastly, it's okay that we disagree here. Okay? Why not? It's different. The rest of the church agrees on everything. They get along great. Only problem is it's bad information. They agree on everything that's wrong. Okay? That's a bad idea. People ought to make choices. And I will actually close with this. When we stand before the Lord Jesus Christ, in the end, these bozos ain't going to be standing in our stead answering for us. You're going to answer to God face to face. Okay? And I need a question. What I'm going to do is read it. Actually, okay. Actually, Andy, what I'm going to do, we're going to forward you the question that came in.
Is it the one you showed? Okay.
Yeah. Would you, and let you stew on it overnight, and you can open up your talk tomorrow by answering that question. How does that sound? That sound okay? Yeah. With that, we'll conclude the conference for the night and meet back here for our continental breakfast, and we'll continue this. Okay?
Breakfast at 9?
Continental breakfast at 9.
Actually, it's going to be